Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Sean Lowery Show. If it's your first time listening, welcome. Welcome to the show. More people have been listening. I've had over 1,000 views and downloads on a few of my recent episodes, and I'm excited, and I just want to keep bringing it every single week. So right now, I'm going to talk about this decade. It's just about over, and I was thinking about this past decade and looking forward and being excited about the next decade, and honestly, I think this past decade was awesome in so many different ways. So that's why I want to look back and review and analyze the last decade. And I want to look back at some of the funny stories as just kind of a recap and a reminder. But also, I want to try to take away like the big picture things that I think shifted this decade overall that are kind of going to be important to know going into the next decade. And I have been doing a little homework on it and thinking about it a little bit. And I kind of do have a number one overall takeaway from this past decade. But I'm going to kind of build up to it slowly over the next 4 episodes. So yeah, I'm going to do 4 episodes about this decade, and I'm going to break them down into different categories. So it's exciting. A new decade is going to be 2020, and right now I'm going to talk about sports. So this isn't a sports podcast, and I've never talked about sports before, but like many people, I grew up obsessed with sports. You know, I've always loved, and I still do love, Notre Dame football. I grew up a huge Yankees fan. Over the past decade, I definitely haven't watched as much sports live, but now it's just so easy to follow on your phone, you know? So I'll be checking the highlights and the standings on my phone, and I keep my fantasy football team updated. I don't watch as many games live as I did as a kid, and I think it's just because I've been running my business, but I do stay up to date, and I don't have teams that I'm obsessed with, and I have teams that I have to watch besides for Notre Dame football, so I kind of get to watch what's entertaining and follow the big storylines. But I'm basically just going to go through the major sports leagues and recap who the champions were and then highlight some of the stories and the things that stood out to me. Commercials and do advertisements. Small players on the bench can maybe do a local ad for the campus, and big players can do national commercials. And they can't miss practice or anything for these ads. But I think that is what actually they're going towards. So it'll be cool to see how that changes over the next decade. But overall, for college basketball, it was a pretty standard decade, and March Madness is as fun as it's always been. There's that week in March where all those games are on during the day. So college basketball, standard decade. But the NBA, that's next. The NBA, I think, is my favorite professional sport. It's got the most entertainment on TV, and there's not a game every single day like there is with baseball, but there's still a lot of games. So I love the NBA, and I think the biggest takeaway from this NBA season and this NBA decade was LeBron James. So LeBron James, and it all started when he did this. Listen to this clip.
LeBron, what's your decision?
In this fall, man, this is very tough. In this fall, I'm going to take my talents to South Beach and join the Miami Heat.
Miami Heat. That was the conclusion you woke up with this morning.
That was the conclusion I woke up with this morning.
Ha, awkward. Honestly, that is awkward. I never noticed how awkward that was. But yeah, LeBron James did the decision when he switched teams from Cleveland to go to the Miami Heat. And it was a really big deal at the time, if you remember. And it was kind of the decade of LeBron. So 2010, the Lakers won. That was Kobe's last championship. And then 8 NBA finals in a row, LeBron was in them. But he lost in 2011 to the Dallas Mavericks, and Mark Cuban got a ring. Mark Cuban's one of my favorite people, so I'm happy to see him get a ring. And then they won 2 in a row, 2012, 2013, the Miami Heat. 2014, the Spurs beat them. And then he switched teams and went back to the Cavs. And he played the Golden State Warriors 4 times in a row, and he only won 1 of them. And last year, the Raptors won. I think what's interesting about LeBron is that he switched teams. I mean, he won 3 championships, and then he went back to his original team. You know, we've lived in the era of Tom Brady, who's won 6 championships with the same team. Jordan won 6 championships with the same team. Kobe won with the same team. LeBron was different this past decade by winning 3 championships with different teams, moving around. And now he's on the Lakers, and the Lakers look tough to beat this year. They look amazing. So I expect them to win a couple more championships. And he has Space Jam coming out this decade. And if he wins 3 more championships this next decade, then that'll be 2 decades in a row dominated by LeBron. And he's a special player. I think that's someone that we'll be talking about the rest of our lives. Looking over the other stories from the NBA, besides LeBron, one thing that I saw over and over again when I was looking through some of the stories was Linsanity, Jeremy Lin. He played for the Knicks in 2012. He's like an Asian player, and he helped them win a bunch of games. I looked that year. They were pretty good. They were first place in their division, but they lost in the playoffs anyway. So the Knicks were never that good. But it was a huge story at the time. It was 2012. Carmelo Anthony was hurt, and Jeremy Lin, this no-name player, took over the team. He had a bunch of buzzer beaters. He was going off, and it was a big story for him, and it was very popular. But honestly, looking back on it now that the decade's over, that is one of the most overblown stories of the decade. He got a huge contract. The thing of the story was we have a new star rising, and he is not a star. He sucks. He's absolutely terrible. He was on the Toronto Raptors, who won the championship last year, but he literally never played. He rode the bench. So he had this Linsanity moment. He got huge money, huge contract, and then he just switched around teams, rode the bench, and I just Googled it. He now is not even in the NBA anymore. He's in China. So that Jeremy Lin, Linsanity was a big story from this decade, but I think it was just because he was in New York with the media. But that was the most overblown story of the decade that did not age well. Jeremy Lin sucks now. So he had a good run, but my last favorite thing of the decade, and it does have to do with LeBron a little bit, but it was in the NBA Finals with J.R. Smith. This moment was epic to me.
Hill misses. Rebound goes to the Cavs. J.R. Smith brings it back out. Throws it to Hill. Hill shot blocked. And we'll go to overtime. You get the feeling J.R. Smith thought they had the lead. He didn't know the score.
I think exactly. That's a bad mistake by J.R. Smith.
All he had to do was get the rebound, make a layup, and they would have won. They would have won the first game, which would have been huge. But they ended up going to overtime and losing, and he just didn't know the score in the NBA Finals. I remember I was sitting there drinking wine that night, and I was astonished and shocked to see a professional athlete not know the score. It's not like he missed a shot or made a bad play. He didn't know the score, and he looked so dumb, like, what? I thought we were winning. Like, that was my biggest memory of a fuck-up from the decade by J.R. Smith. So overall, the decade of LeBron, and obviously the Golden State Warriors too, Steph Curry, they're just like a power team. And that was such a bitch move when Kevin Durant went to the team. They were already the best team, and then they got the best player, and they won another couple championships. But it was a great decade for basketball. Jeremy Lin, that happened. J.R. Smith, LeBron James, Steph Curry. LeBron James was in 8 NBA Finals in a row. That is amazing, and he's looking good going into the next decade. All right, so the NFL, everyone's favorite league, the most popular, the highest rated sport of the past decade for sure. 2010, Drew Brees and the Saints won. 2011, Aaron Rodgers and the Packers won. 2012, the Giants. Then the Ravens, the Seahawks, and then the Patriots. And then the Broncos with Peyton Manning. Then the Patriots again. And then the Patriots were in the last two. They lost to the Eagles. And then they won last year, which was the most boring Super Bowl. But at Tom Brady, again, he won 3 Super Bowls last decade. He won 3 Super Bowls this decade. That's amazing. And we'll see where he goes, if he can play a couple more years. But Tom Brady, what's crazy about him is he was actually, as I'm looking at this, he lost the Super Bowl to the Giants, and he lost the Super Bowl to the Eagles. He's almost like LeBron. He's been in, 9 Super Bowls? Wow. And he's won 6 of them. So Tom Brady, obviously just amazing, and the Patriots. But a really good and exciting and fun decade for the NFL. A lot of star power, quarterbacks, great games. I remember that Patriots versus Seahawks Super Bowl where the Seahawks should have handed it off to Marshawn Lynch, but they threw it and it was intercepted. That was such a great game. So a great decade for the Super Bowl. The Butt Fumble. The Butt Fumble. Oh my gosh. If you don't know what the Butt Fumble is, Mark Sanchez, who, cool story, my cousin actually intercepted a pass from Mark Sanchez in high school. True story. But Mark Sanchez on the New York Jets runs full speed into his own center's ass, drops the ball, fumbles it, and he gets picked up and run for a touchdown. So that was just one of the moments of the decade. I remember ESPN played that over and over and over again. That was hilarious. That was in 2012. Something else that I think was interesting, story from this past decade off the field was the whole Aaron Hernandez thing. Aaron Hernandez murdered people. He killed a guy, and it came out, and then he ended up killing himself after he went to jail. So there was the whole, people were like, what? Aaron Hernandez, who was a tight end on the Patriots, a star player, they found out he was a murderer, and everyone was shocked by that. He ends up going to jail. That whole trial was all over the news, and then he ends up killing himself in jail. So not a great decade for him, but that was a story that I thought was interesting to compare to O.J. Simpson. So O.J. Simpson this decade got out of jail and got onto Twitter. And I think this is so funny. Here's O.J. Simpson's first tweet when he got on social media.
Hey, Twitter world, this is yours truly. Now, coming soon to Twitter, you'll get to read all my thoughts and opinions on just about everything. Now, there's a lot of fake OJ accounts out there, so this one, at the real OJ32, is the only official one. So this should be a lot of fun. I got a little getting even to do. So God bless. Take care. Hey.
But I don't know. That just makes me laugh. I think O.J. Simpson on social media, on Twitter this decade, I think it's only been in the past 2 or 3 years, has just been so funny. I mean, he's a murderer, and everyone knows it. I mean, he didn't get convicted. Everyone knows the story. That wasn't this decade. But seeing him out of jail and just being a regular person and being kind of funny on social media, I think that was just funny and something noteworthy, especially when Aaron Hernandez also went to jail. So those are some off-the-field stories from the past decade. But my main takeaway from the NFL this past decade is game-changing. You'll know if you recognize this. Boom. NFL Red Zone. NFL Red Zone was a game changer this decade. So amazing. I don't know why all the other sports don't have it, but it's just every single play and every single touchdown that's interesting on one channel. So you just turn on the NFL Red Zone channel and every single game is being played. And if it's a boring or if it's a commercial, they don't show it. So they show every touchdown, they show every big catch, every big play. No commercials. That's a game changer for sports. That's one of the reasons sports I don't like to watch live as much anymore. It's just commercials. NFL Red Zone was a game changer from this past decade, and it kind of goes to some of the technology shifts and things like that, which I'll talk about when I'm covering the decade that I've noticed. But NFL Red Zone, amazing thing for the NFL. The Super Bowl is basically a holiday in this country. Sundays are dominated by fantasy football, which has obviously kept the NFL remain popular. But Red Zone, game changer this decade. The NFL had a great decade. And that brings us to college football. So college football, we had Auburn 2010, Cam Newton, and then Alabama, Jameis Winston, and then 2014, Ohio State, which was the first playoff, and then Alabama, Clemson, and then this year again, Clemson's in it, Alabama's not in it. We'll see who wins. It's Ohio State, Clemson, LSU, Oklahoma. The playoffs. That was the main takeaway from this past decade. That was the best move for college football, because college football before, they didn't even have a championship game. The writers and the media, the AP poll, basically picked the winner. And then they had the BCS, like, mathematic formula to pick the winner. But we finally got it figured out. 2014, the playoffs, top 4 teams, they play it out. That has been a huge thing for college football this decade. And Alabama won 4. Alabama won 4 championships out of 10. And that's crazy. Nick Saban, I think he has 6 titles now. And I love when things happen in sports, whether it be Tom Brady this past decade getting to 6, or LeBron James dominating, Michael Jordan decades before winning 6 titles. But Nick Saban has 6 titles now. And I remember hearing back in the day, a coach of Alabama was Bear Bryant, and he won, I think, 10 championships. And you hear about Bill Russell back in the day winning 10 championships. And John Wooden, the coach of UCLA basketball, back in the day, before my time, basically won 10 championships. And you don't think people can get to 10 championships anymore. It seems unrealistic. But Nick Saban coming up in the next decade, if he won 4 this decade and he wins 4 next decade, he'll be at 10, and that'll be legendary. And I love when things can happen in my lifetime that are the best of all time. When you say who has the most Super Bowl championships, or what player won the most titles, or what coach won the most titles, 40, 50, 60 years from now, and those things happened, whether it be Michael Jordan or LeBron James or Tom Brady, in our era, or even more importantly, like 200 years from now, when our great-great-grandkids are following sports, if they're still going on, and then the records will mean so much more. It'll be harder to break them. And the things that happened in my lifetime, and I got to watch them. I always root for that. So I do find myself rooting for Tiger Woods to get that championship, get that majors championship and the most majors of all time. I wouldn't mind seeing Nick Saban get to 10 or Tom Brady get to 10, but I love seeing epic things and epic runs happen in our lifetime. That's why it's cool to recap these things and see where they stand over the test of time. But then that next brings Major League Baseball, which I basically have to rant about. I think that baseball is in a huge demise right now. But first, let me recap. So the Giants won 3 World Series. The Red Sox won 2 World Series. The Cubs in 2016 finally won. That was the highest rated World Series of the decade. The Astros 2017, Nationals 2019. Whatever, kind of a boring decade. But I think, here's my opinion on baseball, my hot take. I think that baseball is dying. And here's my theory why. It's because baseball is successful because it's an American pastime, and it's something that's been handed down from father to son in our culture, a baseball catch with father and son, taking your kid to a ball game, rooting for your baseball team, all the records and the historic 300 home run mark, or the 62 home runs in a season mark, or 3,000 career RBIs. We love all these stats and we idolize them. I grew up watching Sandlot. So basically, baseball is wired into our culture. And here's the reason why it was wired into our culture so early on. It's because baseball is the perfect sport for the radio. It's the perfect sport for the radio, and it grew its popularity in the 1910s, the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. And, TV, obviously, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. But the sport was built for the radio. It's the perfect sport on the radio because you don't need to see the diving catches and the hard hits and the dunks like you do in football and basketball. It's perfect because you can pay attention. You can keep track of the outs. How many outs are there? What inning is it? Top of the 7th, bottom of the 9th. What inning is it? How many outs are there? And then what's the count and who's on base? It's a good sport for the radio because you have to sit there and listen and pay attention, and you can visualize the whole thing in your head on the radio. Basketball and football, they're made for TV, and those are the sports that we're going to keep gravitating to as time goes on. So baseball, that's my radio theory on why it was popular and why it will keep failing. But overall, like the revenue, I was looking at the advertising revenue and the ratings. It actually, ranks pretty good. But compared to itself, it's dying. The World Series is not what it used to be. And I have the ratings here for the World Series. So the World Series ratings. The Cubs in 2016. Such a huge story. If you would have talked about in the 90s or the 2000s, the Chicago Cubs finally breaking that 100-year curse. When the Red Sox broke their curse, it was the biggest news in sports. When the Cubs finally in 2016 got to the World Series and won, that was the highest rated World Series of the decade. But every single World Series from the 1970s to 2006 had higher ratings than the Cubs. The decade had terrible ratings for the World Series. People don't care about baseball anymore. It's a boring sport. It's not fun to watch on TV. It was made for the radio. And as time goes on, I think baseball will become less and less and less popular. And I think it'll fade away from existence over time. I think the only reason it's popular now is just because we do have all these big stadiums and it's built into our culture. But as time goes on, I think the decades are going to continue to just get worse and worse and worse and worse. So that's my opinion on baseball. I think baseball sucks. I can't watch it. It's so boring. And it's every day, and the games aren't that important. So that's one of my biggest takeaways from this past decade is that baseball, the World Series, ratings were just dropping hard, and I think it's going to continue to drop. So my last main thing about this decade is kind of relating to the bigger picture of everything that's going on. I think the biggest shift this decade was just the obliteration of our old habits. And we don't have as much attention to the traditional media outlets that we've used to use. And there's been this rise of independent voices on YouTube and podcasts. And I think fantasy sports have been huge because we're on our phones so much this decade. And obviously that's getting more and more, that's not going anywhere. We're going to always be on our phones and we love having things at our fingertips. So fantasy sports have really helped keep sports relevant, especially for football in this new era. And Red Zone, like I said, has been huge because people are sick of commercials in this new era of how we consume content. But there has been a big shift over this decade. And this has affected sports. But ESPN is one of the people who took a huge hit. Earlier in this decade, they struggled and their ratings were way down. And it's because that people's habits change, like I'm talking about. And personally, I just am so sick of commercials, so that doesn't make me like sports as much because there's a lot of commercials. And that's how ESPN, gets all their revenue from advertisements. But I think they've been kind of picking up their game a little bit lately with their app and how they're doing things. But ESPN, as this culture shifted, they took a big hit and they had to shake it up. Mike and Mike, which was one of their shows they've had on for 10, 15 years, they broke up. Skip Bayless, he had to leave ESPN. But ESPN, they used to be the only place where people got sports news. And then sports became and continued to rise huge in our culture. And they were the only place. But now, with the rise of, like I said, independent media and YouTube channels and podcasts, there's so many other options for people to get their sports. And I think that leads me to one of the biggest winners of this decade, and that's Barstool Sports. Barstool Sports, they are one of the huge winners of this decade and the media shift. They took away from ESPN, and they are a podcast and content network built around sports, and they're just kind of cool guys. They're not on a network, and girls too. And they do shows, kind of like ESPN. ESPN has different shows and podcasts, but they do everything in a traditional way where they have time slots to fill on TV, ESPN 1, ESPN 2. They had so many shows. But Dave Portnoy, who started Barstool Sports, and I think Dave Portnoy is one of the stars of this decade in business because he read the shift of how things are going to change. And he set up his company early in the decade brilliantly to be an independent podcast network. So they don't have a TV time slots that they have to fill, but they have podcasts and they have social media, and they understood how the media consumption of people was going to shift over the decade, and they got in early and they created all those podcasts and all those YouTube channels. They did it for guys and they did it for girls, and they built it around sports. They took advantage of it. They took advantage of the changing landscape of society. Barstool Sports is definitely one of the winners of this decade. ESPN is one of the losers of this decade, but they're both right there. Overall, the past decade, sports have remained an interesting and important part of our culture. The Super Bowl is still the biggest TV event. Athletes are the biggest stars in our culture. People love playing sports video games, buying jerseys. And with the shifts in how we consume entertainment that have happened over the past decade, the world of sports has continued to establish itself as an important part of our culture. So I'm looking forward to the next decade of sports, and it's been fun to talk about sports. And this has been episode 22. I appreciate you guys listening, and come back next week. I'll be talking about another topic about this amazing past decade that's coming to an end. So peace out.